The time when you receive or present an offer, either as a buyer or a seller in real estate, is an exciting time. There's a lot of pressure, a lot of ideas start going through your head. And I find there's a huge advantage in getting to know the paperwork in advance of that time coming. So as a seller, it's helpful if you see what an offer looks like before receiving your first offer, because you're quite distracted about what's the price and when do I have to move out and all those things. So the mechanics of understanding the offer and opportunities for strategy are helpful to discuss in advance, and that's what we plan on doing now. And the same goes for when you're a buyer. There's quite a few documents that go along with the offer, quite a bit to explain. And I find if we can explain that now, today, in advance of you making an offer on a home, that you have a huge head start, a huge advantage, and we can put our focus, you can put your focus with whoever you're working with, on the core talking points, which often are price, dates, and those conditions that go into it. So I have an offer in hand here in front of me, and I'm gonna start working through it and go through what I think are the main talking points to make you aware of. This is an 8-page document that in my hands is actually a 10-page document. In advance to signing an offer, we as agents in the province of BC, so anywhere in BC, but I work in the Lower Mainland around the suburbs of Vancouver, there are 4 documents you have to sign before making the offer if you're working with anyone in my office, definitely before the transaction is done. And there's another 4 documents you might need to sign as well prior to even signing the offer. That's 8 documents. If you're curious what those are, I'll talk about those after the offer. Okay, so the offer. The first 2 pages are actually not numbered. They do not form part of the contract. They're information pages, and they try to tell you more about your offer. If you're interested, read those in advance. We're not touching on them right now. Okay, page 1. And you'll hear people call it, use different terminology. I often refer to it as an offer. We're making an offer. Let's write up an offer. Let's sign an offer. The document itself is titled Contract of Purchase and Sale. It's prepared by lawyers. It's got their credentials, or essentially the offices they come from, listed at the top, and it's lawyers who work for the BC Real Estate Association and associated with the Canadian Bar Association. So the lawyers write this with the interest of all parties in mind. All parties being the buyer, the seller, and the agents who represent them. The idea is that they're all, in a way, equally protected. And a lot of the extra language that has been added just recently to our contract is to make sure there's no confusion on behalf of the consumer that the agent didn't give them the right information. That protects the consumer, but it also protects the agent from the risk of not disclosing the right information. Okay, so page 1 has all of the basic fundamentals, a lot of the most important stuff. It has the name of the buyer and the seller and their address. It has the name of the property. We always want to double check the name of the property, the address, but as long as it's got its property ID and its legal description, we like to double check that those are accurate. That's your agent's responsibility, but you can always double check that if you're previewing a draft in advance. Make sure you're writing an offer for the right address. Okay, paragraph 1 is the purchase price. So this is obviously almost always our most important talking point. Okay, pretty straightforward. I always leave that to the end. The person you're working with might have a different strategy, but I find we need to know what all of the other elements are to decide what the right price approach is, because if it turns out that we're choosing dates that are really unappealing to the seller, we need to reflect that in our price. Or if we have conditions that could be more or less appealing, that might change the way my advice goes around where to start with price. Okay, so we'll have that conversation last. Second line is the deposit amount. Really quickly, roughly 5% of purchase price is the industry norm. That's typically paid in advance, sorry, not in advance, at the end of your subject removal period. So when you remove all your subjects, you pay that deposit. But our paperwork has recently changed, and it's added some complication to that you might run into. And that's about the rescission period. That is what is really the big fundamental change to our contract of purchase and sale. So the rescission period says that if a buyer chooses to rescind within 3 business days of their agreeing to an offer, there's a fee. And some agents may be choosing an approach to say, we want to collect that rescission fee at the time of acceptance, so we know we have it up front. And that will muddy the waters around the conversation of the offer. That's an important thing to talk about in advance with your agent, because you really don't want it distracting you at the time when you're talking about all the strategy of making an offer. What's my right price? What are my right dates? Let's not get hung up on the rescission fee, which is 0.25% of the purchase price. So $2,500 on $1 million, $1,250 on a $500,000 property. It's not a huge amount of money in the grand scheme of things, but it could really distract the conversation. So if somebody says, I want to collect the rescission fee in advance, and as a buyer you look at that and go, well, what if I choose to rescind? Okay, now you get to keep that money. But what if after 3 days I still have subjects on my offer and I say, well, I'm not proceeding because of the home inspection. And the seller says, oh, I don't believe you. There wasn't that much wrong with the home inspection. And now they don't give you back your rescission fee. So there's risk involved with both parties, where the seller feels that the money isn't there, it's available to them, or the buyer feels like it won't be readily returned to them. So that's a talking point to get into. I'm not trying to give a ton of advice in this video right now. I'm trying to explain the offer, but my personal stance and that of a lot of my colleagues has been that if it's a conditional offer, we're not really pursuing getting that rescission fee in advance. That's more important when we're looking at unconditional offers. Okay, so that's the deposit, roughly 5% of purchase price, often paid when all subjects are removed. Maybe a small portion of that is paid upon acceptance. All right. As we get on to page 2, it becomes more open-ended. I've been talking about the fill in the blanks sections of the offer. Page 2 gets us into the section that says terms and conditions, and that's where you and your agent work together to decide what are going to be your conditions of the offer. We call them conditions, we call them subjects, maybe terms. So subject to a home inspection. Now that's a much longer paragraph that has more specifics to it, but generally this offer is subject to the buyer conducting a home inspection, and this condition is for the sole benefit of the buyer. The importance of that language is it means it is a unilateral decision that can be made by the buyer to remove that condition. The seller can't say, oh, I don't agree and I'm not removing it. So once the buyer removes it, that condition is now satisfied, and if all conditions are satisfied, you have a firm and binding contract. In addition to conditions or subject terms, on this section, you'll have just some agreements, understandings, and these are to try to close some loopholes, make sure that people don't have any confusion. So it might say things like, the home will be professionally cleaned prior to possession, or the buyer and seller agree that room measurements are approximate, so they happen to be off by a few inches here or there. No one can make a fuss and use that to try to get out of the contract. That's why that language is in there. So you'll find a number of things depending on what your agent likes to use. Typically on the buyer's side, it's the buyer's agent who's choosing all the normal things to insert. On the rare occasion, a seller and their agent will insert something back in. There's a few things that come in there. So this is quite open-ended. The majority of the terms and conditions that we use are pre-written by lawyers. They're available to us in the system we use to prepare the contracts. And we go through and we select which ones to use and just add some specifics like the deadline to satisfy that condition. Terms and conditions pages can run 1, 2, even 3 pages, sometimes even a fourth. So the contract I'm holding only has 2 pages of terms and conditions, and that makes the totality of the contract 8 pages. So I'm jumping ahead past the terms and conditions. I'm going to, on this contract, which is page 4, and that's where we get the dates. This is something that's helpful to understand in advance of actually writing your offer. This is really where you can get a head start. The dates you select will be very dependent on when you're sitting down to write the offer, but what you want to know is roughly what you're looking at. So in your own situation, if you're renting, you want to know, okay, when do I have to give notice by for certain sort of deadlines? If you're a month-to-month renter, you need to give notice before the end of the month, and then you're paying for the duration of the following month. And you might look at that and say, okay, well, then I'll line up when I take possession of my new home accordingly. Or maybe you want more time, whatever it might look like. So we've got the completion date. Completion date on the contract is, I refer to it as the date of the transaction. So that's when the money and title change hands with the lawyer or the notary. So you become the official owner, or the seller disposes of it on that day. That's just the transaction date. The property, the physical property changing hands is the next line, and that's possession date. So possession date has a date and a time of possession, or if it's a tenanted property, then that's not a specific possession date or time. It's subject to accepting the existing tenancy. Okay, and then the following paragraph is adjustments, and they adjust prorated costs on the home, like property taxes or strata fees or anything else that's billed over the course of a wider period of time. They prorate it to that particular day, whichever day you choose. And just so you know, we typically do it the date of possession. So you pay for what you use. That's how we run through that there. The next paragraph can be very straightforward, or it can become more complicated. The more straightforward you keep it, the easier it is to work through the offer, because we don't want to get too fussed about included items. So included items, that's where you can get into the weird stuff like furniture or garden tools, barbecues, that kind of stuff. But the basics are anything that isn't attached and attached for its functional purpose, and that's called a fixture, is included by default. You don't necessarily need to mention it in the included items, but often we do for clarity. Things that aren't attached have to be written in. So the most common thing that we write in that's not attached is appliances. So if you're unfamiliar with BC real estate, or specifically the Lower Mainland where I work, it's expected that the appliances you view in the home will be included. But you do write them in the contract that say to include the fridge, stove, dishwasher, clothes washer, and dryer. If the microwave hood fan is there, typically we write that in. Let's say it's the one above the stove, but that's attached and it only works if it's attached. So technically it's a fixture. We still write it in just for clarity. But if you really wanted a freestanding microwave that was sitting on the counter, well, 100% that needs to be written in. If it's built into the cabinet, that's a built-in fixture, which should by default be included. Again, it's helpful for clarity to write that in. And that's where we run into some of this stuff where we go, oh, I feel like that wardrobe over there is built into the wall. It's all trimmed in. It looks like it's included, but the seller has a different idea. Well, if we write that in, there's no confusion. Drapes and window coverings, same thing goes there. And then we add in things like garage remotes and keys and that kind of stuff. So if they, the seller just gets a reminder of things to leave behind. Again, if you start getting into furniture, oh, I want this couch included, or these wall shelves, or a TV wall mount, that's good stuff to clarify, because if you want a TV wall mount removed, then the seller needs to repair that, and then you need to have clarity on that, and to what extent are they going to repair it? Are they going to do a good job? Important conversations to have with your agent. And now if you're learning this in advance of going and looking at a home, it's kind of on your radar, and you can ask your agent and they'll look at it while they're there and give you their advice. They may check with the agent for the seller and get their opinion on it. And the more collaboration there, the much better the chances that you're not disappointed on the day when you get the keys. All right, so the next section is used rarely, but it can be really important, and that's exclusions. So the paragraph says included items, and then it says but excluding. And in exclusion, sometimes we might have a chandelier because it's very expensive, or it's a family heirloom, something that is attached, but the seller has every intention of removing. They need to make that clear on the contract, or technically it's supposed to be the buyer's when they move in. This is the one that has caught me a few times, because if you're a homeowner as the seller, you really want to double check this item on your contract and remind your agent, because I've had the conversations with sellers as we've sold the home. I've mentioned it as people walk through and look at the home. So it's been mentioned a number of times, and then the offer comes in and our focus is on price, dates, conditions, and we forget to add that line item in that says the chandelier is not included. And obviously that becomes very disappointing as that's discovered further down the road. So if you're a homeowner, keep an eye on that one and point it out to your agent. I personally would not say it's a huge miss on the agent's part, because there's no way we can automatically include it. It constantly needs to be added manually, so we have to just watch for it. Okay, so that's a hot tip for sellers. Paragraph 8, all we do is write in a date to fill in the blanks there. This paragraph is viewed, and it says the property will be in substantially the same condition when you take possession as it was when you viewed it on said date. Substantially the same condition does not mean identical, but it does mean if there's any damage, if things go wrong, the seller is responsible for repairing that. And that goes for things like I've had somebody have their dryer stop working 2 weeks before possession. Your hot water tank might go. Well, that's on you now to replace that. If your furnace stopped working between when you sold the home and before the person moves in, they get to move into a house with a working heating system. So you'll need to get that repaired or replaced. So those are your contractual obligations as a seller, and as a buyer, that's your peace of mind that you get essentially the same home that you viewed. That's what the contract says. There's a number of other paragraphs in here. We call that the legalese. That's written by the lawyers, and I'm not jumping into that. I'm going to jump ahead to on my contract here, which is page 6, paragraph 21, agency disclosure. There's a number of sections here with a lot of boxes for initials, and as the consumer, you're only going to initial once. You're either going to say, I have an agent as the seller, I have an agent as the buyer, or I've chosen not to have an agent, or I understand that the agent for the seller represents both buyer and seller. So you're acknowledging that you understand who works for who, okay? That part in itself is pretty straightforward. And speaking of initials, every single page at minimum gets the initial from all parties involved on it. Well, buyer or seller, the agents don't sign. At minimum an initial, or on the last page there's a signature, and there's a few bonus spots for initials. But everything you do with your agent as far as paperwork, every single page at minimum will have you initial to acknowledge that yes, you were shown this particular page, not just the document. So get used to that. There is a lot of paperwork. You're generally signing electronically most of the time, and that jumps you through quite quickly, and that is a big warning to you that make sure you do review your paperwork and read it. I've heard stories of people signing offers that had the wrong price on them because the agent there was a typo, they happened to miss it when processing and sending it off for signatures, and the buyers didn't check the price before signing it. So check your documents. Okay, getting near the end here, I'm on page 8. Paragraph 25 is, the heading is offer. It says, this offer or counter offer will be open for acceptance until, and it has a time and a date. So that's when the offer expires. So buyer and seller can negotiate within that time, and they could, that offer could be modified, altered, and gone back and forth a few times. Or let's say I submit an offer to somebody at 3 p.m. that day and it expires at 9 p.m. that night. Generally, it's might only get back to you once. And if they send it back to you at 8:30 p.m. and there's no additional time, you either have to agree to the terms or that time can expire, but then it needs to be extended out. So you cross that off, extend the date or the time for acceptance. And for that new acceptance deadline to be approved, both buyer and a seller initial that change. And where it becomes really important is if you do receive that offer back, it's 8:30 p.m., it expires at 9 p.m., it hasn't been extended, it is the offer that you've decided you're willing to accept, and your agent sends it to you and says, I need you to sign, that deadline is critical. It must be signed before 9 p.m. If you sign it at 9:01 and send it back to your agent, now it's going to need to have an alteration of the deadline, and both buyer and seller will need to initial. So there are times where that timeline is quite critical. Keep that in mind. Okay, you'll sign off on it there. Both buyer and seller on this page are going to sign, and they're going to initial that they are a resident of Canada. That's a new rule. So the province of BC has had a foreign buyer tax for a couple of years, but the federal government now has brought in the foreign buyer ban. There are circumstances where you can not have Canadian citizenship and still be eligible to purchase, but by initialing that you are a Canadian citizen, you're making that declaration and obviously creating some simplicity in all parties involved knowing that there's eligibility in purchasing this property. So both buyer and seller are going to sign there. At the very bottom is a paragraph that says notice for buyer's rescission right. I mentioned the right to rescission. A rescission notice can be extended from the buyer, but it can be delivered by the agent for the buyer. It also could be received by the agent for the seller. So this section right here might say, if you have a rescission notice to deliver as a buyer, don't give it to the seller. This paragraph here says, give it to the agent for the seller, and that can be deemed received, that rescission notice. All right, so that gets us to the end there. I'm just doing a little bit of a review on page 1 and 2 and 3. There are a number of sections here. We're just looking for the rescission amount. That is what I missed in paragraph 1. I knew there was more to the rescission amount. So historically, I've been selling real estate for about a dozen years. The contract has looked pretty similar in the time that I've done this. We've added little bits and pieces for a little extra notice, but this rescission period and the rescission fee has really changed our documentation. So that's where I'm getting used to it, and part of why I'm learning to educate my clients on it more. So after we say what the purchase price is, there's a paragraph or a section that says, relative to that purchase price, what is the dollar amount that would be the rescission amount? So if you make an offer for $1 million, the offer now has to say the rescission fee will be $2,500. And now if you go, counter offer, 1 million, or no, instead of $1 million, it's 980,000. You actually have to do the math, change the rescission fee, strike that out, put a new one on there, and initial that. So you'll notice that it is cumbersome. It may bother you as the seller or the buyer as you see the paperwork go back and forth, but you've just been warned now that that will be part of it. Don't fuss about it too much. Unfortunately, it's on the duty of the seller's agent and the buyer's agent to do the math. You can't just put in a formula, so you have to do the math, 0.25%, and if anybody makes an error on their calculator, it's preferable that somebody catches that. I don't even know what they're going to do if the number amount is wrong on there, if everybody's signed off on it. I don't know what the correct rescission fee would be. And that brings us to supplementary documentation, because there is an extra document about the rescission fee. So there's that too. Okay, so that's our contract of purchase and sale, our offer. Okay, so I like explaining this in advance to a buyer or a seller so that you understand the meaning of each thing, especially the dates where you go, oh, what's completion date versus possession date? And then we come back to price and we go, how is that relevant? Okay, because let's say your dates are really specific and that's the only dates that work for you, you might have to give something up on price to make that happen. You might have to pay more, get a seller to take the bait on that, right? Whereas a seller, you might have to take a lower price in order for the buyer to give you the dates that you really need. It all depends on each situation. So these conversations are going to get much more in depth once you've identified the property that you want and where its asking price is relative to what you think a fair market value is and what kind of dates you think the seller is looking for, those kinds of things. What you can run into is a seller will say, oh, I've bought a property, and you're like, oh, okay, I got their feet to the fire, but they'll say, the only way I sell my house is if you can give me the money on Monday, and I'm not going to give you the house until Saturday. Because what I want to do then is use that money to buy my next house and move into my next house. And once all that's done, then I can give you the house that I'm currently living in. So you've got a 5-day spread in there. Sometimes you can manage that as the buyer and say, okay, I'm willing to do that to make this deal work. But as a buyer, you might say, well, no, I can't because I need the money from a different transaction in order to fund this transaction. So I can't sequence it that way. So the sequencing becomes quite important. And that's where it can be tricky, right? Having those couple days in between, or if you can say, well, I can do it back to back, and maybe that's quite helpful to the seller that you can put it right in the middle. Or maybe it's, if a buyer says I can do it right there, and it's tight in the, it depends. Depends if you're buyer or seller and who likes which more than the other. Back-to-back days is most beneficial to a buyer, especially if they have something to sell. So if they're purchasing something, if you can pay for it one day and move in the next day, that's ideal. But then what you're looking for is another property where maybe when you sell yours, where somebody gives you your money on day 1 and you don't move in until you don't have to move out until day 4. So that's, as a seller, you like the bigger gap, and as a buyer, you like a tighter gap. And sometimes you're both parties. So getting everything exactly as you want is challenging. Okay. That's enough of that. If you have questions, ask me. I'm not giving a lot of advice and strategy on this. This is getting to know the offer. It absolutely gives you a head start and an advantage to a negotiation and writing through an offer. So I hope this has been helpful. Okay, so you can think of that as your information for an offer. I told you there are a number of more documents in addition to this, so I will mention them. Let's see, there could be up to 8. There's probably more, but there's like 4 that must be done, and then another that can be kind of the most common, but they're not all the time. So let me check my list. All right, so my list is the 4 necessary ones. One is about agency, so acknowledging that you have an agent and you understand the rules around agency and what they owe you. Second is a privacy disclosure that says how your personal information will be used by your agent. A rescission form. So as a buyer, you need to sign the rescission form that says, I understand what the rescission period is, how it works, what that fee could be, and when the deadline would be based on the offer that we're planning to write. And then the 4th is signing off on the details of the property. You say, yes, this is the property, these are the property details. Oh, and that's the commission that the agent is going to earn. Every time that we earn revenue commission as a result of working with you, we're required to disclose that. So if I was paid a kickback from a home inspector, for example, I would have to tell you. Most agents don't take any of that because of the complication and the doesn't look good to say, well, I'm getting paid in exchange for this. So generally all we're earning is the commission. You'll see there's a form you have to sign on that. Those are the 4 required forms. The other ones that you may have to sign before even signing an offer. And so it's good to know this. You'd be like, oh my gosh, look at all these papers. I thought I was just getting to the part of an offer. That's exciting. Material latent defect form. So if a seller has signed a material latent defect form, you have to sign it before signing the offer because you're supposed to have been told what that defect is or isn't prior to making your offer. What else do we have? If somebody is somehow a real estate agent themselves or related to a real estate agent, that needs to be acknowledged before reviewing the offer. You might have a Schedule A. This typically goes with a foreclosure where a lawyer says, here's a big long document that says you accept the home as is. That has to be signed before an offer. And also one that I tend to use, it's a recommended conditions form. So if you said, I'm not going to do a home inspection, well, then you would check that box and sign off to say, well, I understand some of the risks that go with that and that I've agreed not to do the home inspection or not to have a financing condition or not to review documents. So those are the things that are in there. And to touch on that, as far as reviewing documents and things, when we put that in our offer, there's generally pretty standard statements around the documents you would want to see if it's a house or if it's a strata property. Your agent knows what those are. The seller would expect you to want to review those. So unless it's a completely unconditional offer, you're generally looking at saying, yeah, I'd like to review those documents. When you're looking at strata, if you can make an offer that says, oh, I've already reviewed all the documents, everything's good, I'm not doing a home inspection, the only thing I need is financing, that can look definitely more clean, because you are not looking at a large collection of documents that might spook you. You can say, I've done all my research. And on a house, there's a lot less paperwork to go with it, but if you were just saying financing, again, you're saying you've signed off on the property disclosure statement and title search and check those off in advance. So your agent, if who you're working with, may advise that you read those in advance to making an offer. So there can be a lot of paperwork before even making your offer. That's the important thing to know. The offer is the exciting part. There are a lot of important things to think about that really have your attention. They're big decisions. The price you're going to pay for this home, when you're going to move in, should I do inspection, not? Those are big decisions. So let's get all this other paperwork out of the way and understood well in advance of that. So all your attention gets to go to the most exciting, most complicated part of the process, and you and your agent can really zero in and focus on that. And I promise you, I've noticed this many times over the years, you'll have much more success if you can just put your focus in those areas. So I'm at my best when I'm remembering and working with you to do this in advance, and you can ask the agent you're working with as well, or you can call me and ask me to be your agent. Hope this has been helpful. Just send me a message if you want to get into any more details. Thanks.